Good evening, I'm David Kramer with Alaska Weather. As always, please visit our website, weather.gov/Alaska, getting updates to the forecast through that means. And you can also call our weather info line at 1-800-472-0391, getting updates to the forecast through that means as well. Starting off, we'll take a look at some of the forecasts that we have out for the state. This is for South Central Alaska, 3-day forecast, including today. Looking at some warmer temperatures, getting up into the 40s for most locations of Anchorage, Homer, Talkeetna, and Valdez. And then for lows, dropping down below freezing most locations. Valdez still staying right around freezing or a little bit above as we get into Friday. And most of the locations, especially nearest to the Gulf of Alaska, are expecting to see some precipitation heading in by the end of the week. Taking a look now down over the Panhandle. On Thursday, we are expecting warm temperatures, highs in the 50s throughout the Panhandle area, with some of the areas in the south getting up into the 60s, or at least near 60. Then as we head towards the end of the week, we are expecting a frontal system to push into the Gulf, and that's going to help bring some showers out throughout the Panhandle area moving into the weekend and early next week. Winds will also pick up as we head into the weekend in the inside waters to 20 to 30 knots over most of the marine areas, and then we'll finally see a decrease in those winds and rain as we move into Monday. Up north, this is a beautiful image that we have for sunset out by our forecast office in Fairbanks, Alaska, and you can even see our weather instrumentation out there in the center of the screen. And we also want to have a reminder now as we get closer towards breakup that we are going to have river watch happening. So if you happen to be out, whether it be flying or other means of travel, and have updates for the river, especially if things are changing rapidly, we appreciate any photos or pictures that you are able to take, and please submit those to the RFC at the email on the right-hand side of the screen, as well as calling in 1-800-847-1739. Again, we're going to be asking for any kind of updates that we can get all throughout Riverwatch. Taking a look at our satellite imagery, the main factor is a frontal system out by the western Aleutian Islands. This is bringing its front, as we watch this again, into the southern portions of the Bering Sea, out through the central Aleutian Islands, with cloud cover extending out over the eastern Bering as well as into the Alaska Peninsula area, bringing up quite a bit of warmer air from the south with it, expecting to see some rain. As we look out over mainland Alaska, pretty clear for most areas. There are some lower clouds out over the Arctic coastline and some fog up there as well. And then finally down by the Panhandle, as we drop down to our surface imagery here, we can see that we have quite a bit of clearing skies, just some lingering light showers near the Sitka area for the remainder of today. And then as we look out over mainland Alaska, high pressure dominating the northern portions, which is where we're seeing the fog underneath that high pressure. And then clear skies for much of the interior into the west coast. But as we get out by St. Lawrence Island, we are going to see some fog out there as well, extending up to the Bering Strait area. Down in south central Alaska, some lighter showers out around Prince William Sound, as well as some showers out by the Bristol Bay area and for Kodiak Island. But the big story here is the frontal system that's pushing towards the western Aleutian Islands, bringing some rain all throughout the Aleutian Islands. And ahead of that system, we are starting to see some of that precipitation get to the Alaska Peninsula as well. And it's starting to make its way to the Pribilof Islands, just some lighter rain out there for the remainder of today. But as we move into tonight, that system is going to continue to slowly move to the east, and we are going to see a spread of rain for much of the Aleutian Islands and getting heavier precipitation now for the Alaska Peninsula. Some of that at the higher elevations into the mountains of the islands. We are going to see some areas mixing with snow as well, but primarily snow as we get by the Pribilof Islands. Ahead of this system, we are still going to see some lingering showers out of the Bristol Bay area, primarily snow overnight. And then some light showers still lingering around the Prince William Sound area, primarily rain for low-lying areas. Out by the Panhandle, we are still seeing fairly dry conditions through the night, and that's going to extend up into mainland Alaska as high pressure continues to dominate out over the northeastern portions of the Arctic coast, with some fog developing underneath that high pressure all along the Arctic coastline, as well as out by St. Lawrence Island. Moving into Thursday, continuing to see high pressure up north, which is keeping clear skies out for much of mainland Alaska. But as our system that's farther to the south continues to push east, it's going to extend its rain even heavier into areas around the western portions of the Gulf of Alaska, bringing in rain to Prince William Sound, the eastern Kenai Peninsula, as well as Kodiak Island. Some heavier rain out by the Alaska Peninsula, and continued rain for areas along the Aleutian Islands. Most of these locations in the higher elevations could be cold enough to still see snow, but low-lying areas will be primarily rain. However, as we get into the central Bering Sea, we are going to see more snow for the Pribilof Islands, and some areas around Bristol Bay and the mountainous terrain could see some snow as well. Panhandle area on Thursday still expecting to be dry. However, there are more showers out over northwestern Canada. Then finally on Friday, with our frontal system pushing into the Gulf of Alaska, we're seeing those southerly winds out over the Panhandle area, bringing up a lot of moisture from the south. So we are expecting to see quite a bit of rainfall for the Panhandle area, especially later on Friday. We are going to see this system pushing more to the east, bringing in more and more rain as we get, especially into Friday evening time frame. Up in areas way farther to the north in the higher elevations around Haines, we could still see a little bit of snow mixing in with the rain. And then along the North Gulf Coast, primarily rain, but again, in those higher elevations, we could still see some snow. As we get into the Copper River Basin, primarily snow, as well as out through the Talkeetna Mountains and the Alaska Range. As we drop down towards Kodiak Island in southwest Alaska, primarily rain at those low-lying areas. Some of the higher elevations could still see some snow. Then a mix of rain and snow as we look on the backside of this low up by the Alaska Peninsula, extending out to the central Aleutian Islands. Those northerly winds coming in are going to pull down some of that colder air and bring a mix of rain and snow to the area. However, out west by the western Aleutian Islands, still warm enough to see primarily rain showers. Out over the interior, as well as the west coast and Arctic coastline, we're going to have diminishing clouds as we get farther to the north. Clear skies expected as we get up along the North Slope area, without any precipitation for most of these areas. Taking a look at our low temperatures for Thursday morning in the Panhandle area, dropping down to near freezing most locations. Sitka staying a little bit warmer at 38 degrees. Yakutat, however, going all the way down to 28 degrees. Out over south central Alaska, dropping down into the 20s in most locations. A little bit warmer there at Homer, 31, and then 32 for Kodiak City. However, in the Copper River Basin, we are expecting temperatures to remain cold, dropping down to 14 degrees around the Golcana area. Thursday afternoon highs throughout south central Alaska, getting up into the mid-40s, 41 for Kodiak City. And then in the Panhandle, expecting most locations to get into the 50s, southern locations near 60, getting up to as high as 59 degrees. As we drop back down on Friday morning, dropping into the mid-30s most locations in the Panhandle, with Sitka still remaining warmer, only getting down to 40 degrees. For south central Alaska, dropping down into the mid-30s for most locations. However, interior locations such as Talkeetna getting down into the 20s, 27 for Talkeetna and 20 for Golcana. Friday afternoon in south central Alaska, getting back up into the mid-40s with 48 for Anchorage, Homer, and Talkeetna. And then down in the Panhandle area, temperatures getting up into the lower 50s for most locations. Still warmer farther to the south, mid-50s there. And Yakutat only getting up to 48 degrees. Moving up into the interior, we'll start out east in the interior, getting down into the teens for many locations. However, Fairbanks and Delta Junction both only getting down to 22 degrees for Thursday morning. As we move into western locations, down into the 20s, 24 for Galena. Then up into the Arctic coastline, colder as we get to the areas farther to the east, dropping down below zero, but staying in the positive numbers for areas out to the west. Along the west coast in the Kotzebue Sound area, dropping down into the mid-teens, and then the mid-20s for the Norton Sound area, with 21 for Gamble. Thursday afternoon highs getting up into the 40s for much of the interior. Fairbanks the warmest at 50 degrees. Then up along the Arctic coastline, getting up into the teens, most locations warmer as we get farther to the west, getting into the 20s. Then Kotzebue Sound area right around 30 degrees, and then the lower 40s for Norton Sound. Let's move into Friday morning in the interior, dropping down into the teens to mid-20s, getting warmer as we get farther to the west, getting into the mid-20s there, 25 at Galena. Up along the Arctic coastline, near zero for most locations. Down into the teens for Kotzebue Sound and mid-20s for the Norton Sound. Friday afternoon highs in the interior, primarily getting into the 40s, some places near 50, with McGrath and Fairbanks getting up to 52 degrees. In the teens for much of the Arctic coastline, and then into the upper 20s to low 30s for the Kotzebue Sound area and low 40s for the Norton Sound area. Down in southwest Alaska, Thursday morning dropping down to near 30 degrees, and then lower to mid-30s for the Aleutian Islands. Thursday afternoon highs getting up into the 40s for the southwest, near 40 for the Alaska Peninsula and Aleutian Islands. Friday morning lows dropping down into the mid-30s for southwest Alaska, mid-30s continuing for the Alaska Peninsula, and lower to mid-30s for the Aleutian Islands. And finally on Friday afternoon highs getting back up to near 50 degrees for southwest and staying in the lower 40s for much of the Alaska Peninsula and Aleutian Islands. For our climate, we're looking out at our 6 to 10 day outlook, and we are seeing temperatures going to have better chances to be above normals for the west coast, highest in southwest Alaska, and a little bit lower as we get to the eastern locations of the mainland. In our 8 to 14 day forecast, going to be fairly same conditions, a little bit less chances along the west coast to get above those normals.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
For aviation, we'll start off with a look at our flying weather on Thursday morning. Out over the Bering Sea, we're going to track our front pushing slowly to the east, bringing IFR conditions to the central and eastern Aleutian Islands, as well as much of the central and northern Bering Sea. We also have some areas of IFR up along the north slope, and then some MVFR out over the Gulf of Alaska, but much of the mainland and panhandle remain VFR. As we move into Thursday afternoon, our front pushes more closely to the Alaska Peninsula, bringing IFR conditions from the Alaska Peninsula through the central Aleutian Islands, as well as much of the central, eastern, and northern Bering. Some of that IFR is going to extend up into the Chukchi Sea, as well as staying along the north slope, and more IFR conditions expected in the Gulf of Alaska area, including Kodiak Island. As we move into Friday, front pushes farther to the east, bringing IFR conditions to the southern half of Kodiak Island, as well as some more of the Alaska Peninsula, and finally making it into south central area, bringing in some IFR to the eastern portion of the Kenai Peninsula. MVFR throughout much of the Gulf and starting to make its way into the Panhandle, but VFR conditions for much of the mainland still remain, especially throughout the interior. IFR conditions just off the coastline of the North Slope, and a mix of MVFR and IFR for the remainder of the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands. Finally, Friday afternoon, more MVFR and IFR for much of the Bering and Aleutians, and as our front pushes closer towards the Gulf of Alaska, IFR conditions will have moved through much of the Gulf as well, but lingering for the eastern portions of the Kenai Peninsula, as well as at Kodiak Island, and MVFR extending further into areas of the Panhandle. Much of the mainland continues to be VFR, and then IFR up along some of the Arctic coastline areas of the North Slope. Looking at our passes as we saw in the previous maps, going to be primarily VFR and AKwx VFR throughout the day Thursday, as well as Adigan. All throughout the Alaska Range, including Lake Clark and Merrill, both going to be VFR. Rainy VFR conditions expected, as well as at Windy, Isabel, and Mentasta Pass. Tanita Pass also expected to be VFR throughout the day Thursday, as well as at Portage, and Chilkoot and White both expected to be VFR on Thursday as well. Freezing levels, our surface freezing line rides through northern portions of the Bering Sea, then through southwest Alaska and south central, and then to the north of the Panhandle area. 2,000 feet freezing levels are going to be out over the western portions of the interior, as well as just to the south of the Aleutians and into the Bering Sea, with an area of 4,000 feet in the southern portions of the Panhandle. For our icing, our front is bringing in some areas of icing extending from the central Aleutian Islands through the southern portion of the Bering Sea and then out across the Alaska Peninsula. All of these areas expected to be between 3,000 and 10,000 feet, and this will continue to push farther to the east as we move throughout the day on Thursday, extending more into Kodiak Island and southwest Alaska. For the jet stream, we are looking at strongest portion of the jet exiting our area of the eastern Gulf up to as high as 110 knots south of the Panhandle area, but up by the Panhandle it's going to be closer to 90 knots out of a northwesterly direction, 75 knots out over south central Alaska. Another portion of the jet out over the western Aleutian Islands up to as high as 95 knots out of a northwesterly direction as well. Taking us down to 9,000 feet, the strongest winds are going to be around our low pressure system out by the eastern Aleutian Islands. We're going to see some areas up to as high as 60 knots just to the south of the central Aleutian Islands, but dropping down to near 40 for much of the islands themselves, and 40 out of an easterly direction through much of the Bering Sea around the Pribilof Islands area, as well as 45 knots down by the Alaska Peninsula out of a more southerly direction. Dropping down into the 30s and 20s as we get over southwest Alaska, 25 near St. Lawrence Island, and then 30 knots through south central Alaska by the Anchorage area out of a southerly direction. Winds over the Arctic coastline are going to be very weak under high pressure, and winds also down over the Panhandle are going to be weak as well. Down to 3,000 feet, high pressure out over the eastern portion of the Gulf of Alaska, keeping winds fairly light out there, especially over the Panhandle. Relatively calm expected on Thursday at 3,000 feet. However, much of mainland Alaska fairly light as well, but as we get down by our low pressure system and our front pushing through, we are going to see those stronger winds there, up to as high as 55 knots out of a southeasterly direction through the Alaska Peninsula. It's a good direction for some gusty winds as well, so expect higher gusts through the passes of the peninsula on Thursday. Those winds are going to continue to push east as well, bringing in those stronger winds to the Kodiak Island area as well as the mainland southwestern locations in the 40s for most of those locations. Up along the Arctic coastline, we are going to see winds out of an easterly component around 30 knots. And then down back into the Bering Sea on the western side of our low pressure system, winds up to as high as 55 knots out of the north for the central Aleutians. For our turbulence, for the eastern and central and western Aleutians, below 3,000 feet from moderate is expected. And then for the Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak Island, below 5,000.
Welcome back to another edition of Alaska Weather Facts. I'm meteorologist Dave Snyder, joined once again by the science liaison of GINA, Eric Stevens. GINA, of course, is the Geographic Information Network of Alaska, based up at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. And GINA is all about satellites, and Eric is always here to tell some really cool stuff about satellites. Now, the last time you were here, we talked about how the weather satellites can see clouds and what's under the clouds, but you're telling me that satellites can do a lot more, even protect the general public with aviation safety information.
That's right. There's one particular aspect of satellites we're going to talk about today that might not be immediately obvious, and that is detecting things in the atmosphere that are not clouds, that are not snow, not rain, but rather a hazard that can happen here in Alaska, and that is volcanic ash.
Of course.
When a volcano goes off, puts ash in the air, this is of course a hazard to the public if the ash were to fall on the ground in accumulating amounts.
Sure.
Additionally, while the ash is in the air, and this is the more frequent hazard, is it's a hazard to aviation because you cannot fly an airplane into volcanic ash without great risk. Worst case scenario, the ash gets into a jet engine, wrecks the engine, kills the engine, and now you have an airplane flying with no engines. It won't fly for long. So aviators need to avoid that ash. How do you avoid the ash? You have to know where it is by identifying it with a satellite image and perhaps predicting then where the ash will flow with the overall weather patterns. Satellites are so important for identifying when a volcano goes off and then tracking the ash after the volcano injects the ash into the atmosphere.
Now, are you talking about seeing the heat signature or a huge volcanic plume with a cloud that we're used to seeing in the really pretty pictures of any Alaska volcano that's erupted recently, Redoubt, for example? Or are we talking about the really fine details? Because this is polar orbiting satellites, the ones that are very low to the ground, right?
The geostationary satellites can do some detection. The polar orbiters, like you say, they're closer to the Earth. They give the even better view. In answer to your question, I would say all of the above.
Oh, okay.
A heat signature from a volcano going off with all the heat that comes with the eruption, that can be identified in infrared imagery.
Okay.
We've got images from the Kamchatka Peninsula. That's the far eastern part of Russia on the western side of the Bering Sea, loaded with volcanoes.
Right.
You know, Alaska has plenty of volcanoes of its own. We can also be affected when a volcano goes off in Kamchatka, say, and then the weather carries that ash toward Alaska from the west.
Right.
You can see the infrared heat signature, like you say. Also, the ash in the air can be detected by doing some sophisticated channel differencing within the satellite data. You can find the identification of sulfur dioxide, say, that's a component of the volcanic emission, and you can trace this with the satellite imagery. Sometimes volcanoes go off that haven't gone off before, and we're not expecting them to go off. Say if there's no seismometers around a given volcano that hasn't gone off in 100 years, you might not be expecting it to go off in the satellite imagery. Since satellites can be globally comprehensive, that might be the first sign that you have that a volcano in an unexpected area is going off.
So it's a good backup system. Okay.
Right.
Wow.
Right. And people are working all the time on automating the interrogation of satellite data by computers to provide a first alert to a human, so the software will say, we think this might be important. Human, go take a closer look. Because the people are still the best way to interrogate the imagery, but the planet's a big place, and we can't be looking everywhere all the time, so the software helps give a first cut. And then in Alaska, there's a special kind of surprise angle where the satellites are helpful, and that is the Katmai eruption of 1912. Huge eruption. There is still somewhat of a moonscape out there in southwest Alaska where all this ash is laying on the ground. And sometimes a strong weather pattern comes along where we have roaring northwest winds that go across the Alaska Peninsula there and can actually pick some of this ash up off the ground. No volcano is going off. This was more than 100 years ago that volcano actually blew. So you're not going to see a heat signature like we were discussing. There will be no seismic signature of a volcano going off. So those data sets, they'll say, oh, no problem. But you can see in some of the satellite imagery this ash, as it's called, resuspended. When the wind comes along, picks it up, the ash can be lofted a few thousand feet in the air just with the wind. And an airplane flying into that plume is exposed to some danger. So we need to track that ash to provide guidance to aviators that you don't want to be flying here at these elevations in this area. We've got some imagery of the resuspension, and you can see the wind blowing strongly from the northwest, picking up the ash and blowing it down to the southeast. And so that's another, perhaps not immediately obvious hazard of volcanic ash. Katmai is the gift that keeps on giving, for sure.
Very good. So we've got satellites that can help us understand the weather from the past and the immediate past, and we talked last time about how that's feeding into the forecast modeling to help improve predictions, but now they're also protecting the general public with aviation sensitive information and watching volcanoes, whether they're erupting or maybe have erupted in the past, and finding the left behinds from those volcanic events there. So really impressive stuff. Eric, thanks so much for joining us again today, and you're a gift that keeps on giving from the satellite community, so thanks a lot, and we hope to have you back again soon. Again, Eric Stevens with Gina at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. And if you'd like to check out any of the information that Eric has shared with us again today, you can do that very easily by going to www.gina.alaska.edu. I'm meteorologist Dave Snyder, and thanks for joining us for another edition of Alaska Weather Facts.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Welcome back for the marine forecast. We'll start off with a look at our ice edge. Due to the easterly winds that we've had bringing offshore flow along much of the west coast of the state, a near continuous polynya has formed from Unalakleet all the way down to Nunavik Island. And then for the Kuskokwim Delta through the Yukon Delta, shorefast ice in the area has been starting to erode along the edge as well as start to melt. Looking at our marine forecast down in the southeast, inside waters out of a northerly direction around 15 knots until we get to the southern locations where we'll see a southerly component around 10 knots. Eastern portion of the Gulf of Alaska, northwest winds 10 to 15, and then southerly winds 10 to 15 up north. On Friday, things are going to pick up quite a bit as that front approaches the area, where out over the Gulf waters we have southerly winds 25 to 30 knots in the eastern locations, and then easterly winds 30 to 35 knots up north. Inside waters picking up as well, northerly winds 15 to 20 knots, in central locations gusting up to as high as 35 knots, and then in the southern inside waters, southeast winds 25 knots expected. Out over south central Alaska, primarily easterly flow, most locations, strongest in more western locations of the southern Kenai Peninsula down to the Barren Islands areas, around 20 knots there, as well as in 20 knots out of northeast and Cook Inlet, and then a little bit weaker in the northern part of the Gulf, 10 to 15 knots, and 10 knots in Prince William Sound out of the north. On Friday, picking up here again, continuing to have easterly flow, 35 to 40 knots out over the Gulf waters, 25 knots in Prince William Sound, 30 knots over Cook Inlet, and 35 knots west of the Barren Islands. Out over the Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak Island, stronger winds out of the east, 40 knots for southern and western locations as you get by Kodiak Island, 30 knots there, and then 35 knots out of Bristol Bay. On Friday, going to see primarily easterly winds by Kodiak Island area, 25 to 30 knots there, dropping down to 20 knots on the Pacific side of the Alaska Peninsula and becoming more northerly as we get farther to the west, seas up to as high as 17 feet, highest on the Pacific side. Bristol Bay, 30 knots out of the northeast, and then 20 knots as we get farther to the west. Out over the Aleutian Islands on Thursday, starting off out west, we have northwesterly winds, 35 to 40 knots by the western Aleutian Islands. 30 to 35 knots by the central Aleutians, then dropping down as we near the center portion of the low pressure system down to 15 knots by the eastern Aleutians, and then becoming south 20 to 30 knots as we get farther east on the eastern Aleutian Islands. On Friday, continuing to see stronger winds up to as high as 30 to 35 knots from most locations of the Aleutians out of a north to westerly direction, becoming more southwesterly as we get by the western Aleutians, and only 20 knots out there. Along the west coast of the state, primarily easterly winds strongest in the south, 35 to 40 knots south of Nunavik Island and by the Pribilof Islands, and then down to as low as 15 knots up by the Norton Sound and St. Lawrence Island areas. On Friday, seeing primarily northerly winds, 15 knots up north, getting as high as 30 knots, once again strongest south of Nunavik Island and by the Pribilof Islands. 12 feet are the highest seas by the Pribilof Islands. Along the Arctic coastline, easterly winds 20 knots are expected, becoming a lot weaker along the west coast, more variable as we get by the Kotzebue Sound area, and then by the Bering Strait, northeasterly winds 15 knots expected. On Friday, along the Arctic coast, we're seeing winds 15 to 30 knots, strongest farther out east by Kaktovik, and then along the west coast, still pretty light and variable, 5 to 10 knots there, and then through the Bering Strait, northerly winds 15 knots expected. Quick recap of the weather as we head towards the end of the week here. For tonight, low pressure system by the central Aleutian Islands that's continuing to track to the east, bringing rain and some areas of lighter snow to the Aleutian Islands and Alaska Peninsula. Snow primarily at those higher elevations in the mountains. Some light snow showers out by the Bristol Bay area, as well as some lighter showers around Prince William Sound. But the Alaska Panhandle, as well as much of the mainland, including the interior, west coast, and Arctic coastline, should be dry for tonight. However, there will be some areas of fog along the Arctic coastline and by St. Lawrence Island. As we move into Thursday, that system is going to push farther to the east, spreading the rain and snow out further into Kodiak Island, southwest Alaska, and as well as the northern Gulf Coast, Prince William Sound, and Kenai Peninsula. Once again, higher elevations may see some snow, but primarily going to see rain with this system, except for the Pribilof Islands that will be cold enough to remain snow. The Panhandle, as well as much of the remainder of the mainland, are going to be dry again on Thursday. Then finally, on Friday, that frontal system will push into the Gulf of Alaska, spreading precip all throughout the Gulf Coast waters, as well as into the Panhandle, with that southerly flow bringing primarily rain. However, the central and northern locations of mainland Alaska is still expected to be dry. Northerly flow out over the Bering Sea and Aleutians will start to transition the rain over to a mix of rain and snow on Friday. For Alaska Weather, I'm David Kramer.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.